Hello, everyone. Dr. Tony Scuderi here. I'd like to welcome you to the Zoom presentation on physiology, how the brain works. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start this by sharing my screen with you. All right. So, let's talk about the brain. Let's take a look at how the brain is being dissected. Okay. First of all, this is what a brain looks like. As you take it out of the skull. Basically, tissue. It feels kind of spongy if you were to hold on to it. It's approximately 5 to 8 pounds. And this is your computer. It has several different areas over here, in this area, back in here, and back here. These are called lobes. You have what's known as the frontal, and I'll go over these again. Frontal, uh, the temporal, the parietal. You have the pons, the medulla oblongata, this area. Little folds that you see are called gyri or gyrus, and these little slits that you see in here are called sulci or sulcus. All right. So let's take a look at the brain. This is a brain not on drugs. We see here that in the frontal lobe, we have what's known as the association cortex, and then we have an area called Broca's area, and I'll discuss all of these later. As we go from the front to the back of the brain, we see this little area here called the association, the auditory cortex, auditory meaning voice, and it's a little space in between the motor cortex here and the temporal lobe over here. As we go up, we see two little strips. We have the parietal lobe. We have the motor strips here. This is the motor cortex for movement. Sensory cortex, somatosensory cortex for our sensation. As we go a little bit further back, we've got this little area called the parietal lobe with another association cortex in that, and we'll talk about that later. And then we have your visual cortex or your occipital lobe and Wernicke's area. Frontal, temporal, parietal, this whole thing is the parietal, and the occipital lobe. As we go back here, which is not labeled, we have the pons right here, medulla oblongata right here, and this is the spinal cord here. All right. So let's talk about the frontal lobe. Let's talk about the association cortex. First of all, the frontal lobe is the seat of your executive functioning, and there are two parts in it. You've got the prefrontal cortex, which is here in this area, and you have the frontal cortex, which is here. Now, it's reversed. It looks like, well, geez, isn't this the front and isn't this the back? No, you go from back to front. So we have here within the frontal lobe, frontal cortex, you have the prefrontal and you have the frontal. So the frontal lobes are important for things like movement, expressive language, okay? And the expressive language is here in Broca's area, okay? This is called Broca's area. It's a little area in the prefrontal cortical region right here. This is expressive language. What I'm doing to you right now is expressing things. I'm talking to you. In the event that there is damage to this, let's say for a cerebral vascular accident or a stroke, sometimes this area is affected and speech will be affected. So as I'm talking to you right now, speech would sound something like this. Do I add some type of damage to the area? It would sound like this. It would be slurred speech, slowed speech, almost inaudible speech. Okay? The expressive language area in Broca's area. There's also the area for managing higher level executive functioning. So the frontal cortex here is also called the executive functioning cortex. So when we talk about executive functioning, we talk about the collection of all kinds of cognitive skills, knowledge, the abilities to plan things, to organize things, to direct things, to control things, to start things, to monitor ourselves, monitor our thinking. So we think about thinking in this area. We control responses and we achieve different types of goals. Okay. So this is called that area. Now, in the prefrontal area, this is called the association cortex. So the association cortex is part of what we call the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum, the head part. It receives a lot of impulses from different areas around us, um, association areas. When we take two things and we want to try to make them, make sense of them, we have a pencil, and then we'll sit there and say, "What is this?" Well, that's a pencil. It looks like a pencil. That's associating it. Also, from the connections between the sensory and motor areas. So the motor cortex, as I said earlier, is right around this area here, the motor cortex, right? So the sensory cortex, the association cortex, takes information from that area. They're involved in organizing information. It comes from various areas of the brain. So as we see, the brain is totally interconnected and it associates, it pulls things together. So it takes all the complex functions of the brain and it pulls it together in this area to give us the ability in a way that we can understand it. This is why it's called the executive functioning, because it executes, it allows us, it is the main functioning area. It's a collection of all of our cognitive skills, everything we think about. We now move to the side of the cortex. This is called the motor cortex. As I showed you before, it comes in two strips. This is the frontal right here, the prefrontal cortex, and right behind it is the motor cortex. One of two cortexes in the parietal lobe, right? The motor cortex. This is a region within the whole brain, with the cerebral cortex, where we plan things, we control things. Also, it executes voluntary movements, hand movements, mouth movements, right? We walk, we talk, we gesticulate. All this comes from the motor cortex, right? All the voluntary movements, voluntary. This does not control heart rate, respiration, breathing, pulse. That's in a different area of the brain. This area, the motor cortex, controls all of our voluntary movements, the things that we do. I want to take a pencil and pick it up. I want to write on the board. I want to wave to you and say hi. This is all part of the motor cortex. Talking, right? I know I talked about Broca's area, and if there's a stroke or a cerebrovascular accident in that area, how speech slurs. Well, part of that is within this area too. They're all interconnected. So classically, the motor cortex is the area of the frontal lobe located in the backside or where it's posterior precentral gyrus. This is a gyrus. Remember I said this, right? The little folds. So we have the central gyrus, which is in the center part of the brain. This is a little bit before. It's the mirror. It's right behind the central sulcus, or the central part of the brain that I'll show you later. It takes the brain. If you were to take a look at that, it would split the brain beautifully in half, up part and center part. Okay, the next one right behind this motor cortex, as you can see, this motor cortex is what's known as the sensory motor cortex. Okay? The primary sensory cortex. This is in charge of processing of feeling sensations, which are called somatic sensations. Soma comes from the Greek word soma, which is body, right? So these are body sensations. Things that we feel in our body are stimulated and observed from the sensory motor cortex. These areas are from receptor positions throughout the body, so different receptor sites that we have. We put our hand on a flame and we get burned. Ouch. Well, this is where the ouch comes from, right? The nerves are all connected and it shoots, the pain goes from the fingers through the spinal cord up to this area, and we feel that sensation, milliseconds, right? So from any place in the body is where it happens. So the position of the body in space and the stimulation that that part of the body has results from the effects of the neurological impulses area. Okay. Nociception. Okay. Nociception. 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 Okay. That is the funny word for pain. Nociception. And temperature. It also happens from here, where we notice pain and where we experience uh, physical pain, physical trauma, whatever it may be. Now, damage to this area sometimes causes people, sometimes people are born with this, they feel no pain. So they can break a leg and they won't feel it because there's some type of damage in this area here. That can be very dangerous because we've seen in literature people that have been walking around limping or not being able to walk and they have no pain, don't understand why. Then when they're taken to the ER and they get X-rays, their leg is broken, but they feel no pain. That's nociception. The idea of pain and temperature. So the parietal lobe has a different number of functions. It is the primary area for what we call somatic sensations, senses of touch, of the limb position, the association of somatic sensories, the visual, the auditory activity for the analysis of space, where we are in space and time. Okay, that's proprioception, it's called, where we are in space and time. It analyzes where we are in space and time, and it transmits to the rest of us where we are in space. I'm sitting in a chair right now in front of a desk, in front of a camera, in front of a computer, with my dog sitting to the left of me and my coffee pot to the right of me. It tells me all of these things. All right. This is basically from the sensory motor cortex. Right behind that, here's your sensory motor. Right behind it is what's known as the association cortex. These are all part of the parietal lobe. So if I go back a couple, we got the motor cortex, we got the sensory motor cortex, and we have the association cortex are all in the parietal lobe. So it's got a number of different functions. The primary area, the primary cortical area for body sensations is in this association cortex. It gives us a sense of touch. It gives us a sense of limb position. It associates somatosensory or body experiences. It also is associated with visual and auditory activity, which is connected to another part of the lobe, another part of the brain lobes, right? Also for the transmission of spatial information, where we are again in space and how far things are apart from each other. This gives us the area where we can tell the differences between, oh, this is 2 inches, this is 4 inches, right? It's the transmission of spatial information and also part of how we associate the things during movement, during motor sensations. So as we go down from the association cortex here, we slide down. Remember here I talked about visual and auditory activity? Well, that's right here. Visual activity is here in the back part of the brain. This part of the brain is called the occipital lobe. This is part of our visual process. It processes and interprets everything that we see. The occipital lobe is also responsible for anything that we analyze. For example, shapes, colors, sizes, something else is moving, distances, how we can draw conclusions about what we see. So let me stop sharing for a second here. So if I sit there and I show you this, what is this? We see this. It's a mug that says love on it, right? So it's a mug. What makes that different from this? A telephone. So this is all part of what we see in that area in the occipital lobe area. So that's all over here. That's in that area of the occipital lobe. Interprets, it draws conclusions about different things. So from the occipital lobe, as we go down, we now come to the side of our brain. This is called the temporal region. It's close to the ear, okay? The temporal process, memories, integrates memories with sensation, with taste, with sound, with sight, with touch. All that comes into this area here. Also, it's believed to play an important role in how we process things like feelings, emotions, the way we look, the way we touch. If we take this, and we'll see this later on, if we take this and we go deep into the center of the brain, we have an area called the limbic system. This is close to the limbic system. The limbic system, as we'll see, is a different structure in the brain. What this does is this is allegedly the seat of our emotions, our feelings, our sensations, and what we feel, what we touch. We love somebody, we like somebody, we are attracted to somebody, we're not attracted to somebody. We cry, we laugh, we feel neutral, we feel nothing. That's all part of the limbic system. Temporal lobe over here deals with things like hearing, and in the back part of the temporal lobe, which we'll see in one moment, deals with another part of speech, right? Remember this area right here, Broca's area, deals with speech production, how we voice things, how we produce things, how we say things. The temporal lobe over here is a dominant area in our brain. For most people, it's the left side, and is involved in understanding language. So where Broca's area understands language, this part of the brain, besides hearing, is involved in what we understand about the language, how we learn language, and how we remember verbal information. Part of the brain right there, right, is called Wernicke's area. We'll get to Wernicke's area in 1 second. Okay, so this area here is called Wernicke's area, and that's the back part of the temporal lobe, as opposed to Broca's area, which is in the prefrontal cortex, slightly above the temporal lobe, just touching the temporal lobe in this area. So we see the motor cortex, again, why we move our mouth and stuff, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because the motor cortex right here talks, we gives us the motor sensations of how we move our lips and tongue and all that stuff. We have the frontal cortex here, executive functioning of we see something and we give it a name. And then we need to formulate the words of that, pointer, brain, film presentation, boring professor, that type of stuff. And then over here in the back part of the temporal lobe, in Wernicke's area, we have the understanding of language. And we'll talk about this in 1 second and what happens if danger comes to that or damage comes to that. So as we go up, right in between the temporal lobe over here, where both the motor cortex and sensory motor cortex connect to the temporal lobe, we have the auditory cortex. So this plays a critical role in our ability to understand what we are understanding. Proprioception is called. Thought to be integral in our perception of fundamental aspects of auditory stimulation. Pitch, sound, for those of you that are musicians that like to hear music, if your ear is very keen and well trained, you can pick up the difference between sound. If you ever get a glass and take a little knife or a fork next to it, you hear that ding, right? That's where this comes from, this area. That's how we can perceive it. It's also important in various aspects of sound producing, singing and all of that stuff, determining where space and sound originates, as well as identifying what might produce the sound. So let's say you're in the woods and all of a sudden you hear, right? And you're looking around, you hear something, what's that? And all of a sudden you hear that sound and you turn your head in the direction of that sound. Well, how do you know it's coming there? Well, this is the area of the brain that tells you that this is where the sound is coming from, and that sound also comes from this part of the brain, which allows you to identify this is a sound coming from this area, this time and space, in this woods. All of that information is within these 3 areas here. 1, 2, 3, well, 4 areas. 1, 2, 3, 4. So higher level auditory processing, recognizing aspects of sound specific. Damage to this area can disrupt various facets of auditory perception. For example, if it's caused by a stroke, it might cause deficits in the ability to detect changes in pitch, localization of sound in space, and to understand speech. So if there's damage to this area, if we have a cerebral vascular accident, again, over right here is Broca's area. So this is also connected to Broca's area, the formulation of speech. So damage to this auditory cortex can also interfere with how we hear the sound, right? So damage to this area, we may not be able to hear the sound, or there may be a staticky type thing. Sometimes there's a condition called tinnitus, a constant ringing in the ear, which really has no cure to it. And that's really nasty to have. That drives you crazy. Has damage to this area in combination to it. So if we listen to a concert, Mozart, Beethoven, or some of the modern stuff that we hear, with rock and roll and all this other kinds of stuff, the changes in pitch and sound, if they are detectable in this modern music, this is where this comes from. In this area, we can hear the different tones and sounds. As I'm talking to you, the temper of my speech, it's also called, the raising of my voice, the lowering of my voice, the normal tenor of my voice. I can take this and go very high if I want, or very low if I want. All these different areas. If you hear those changes, you can thank this part of your brain, the auditory cortex. So let's talk a little about Broca's area, the auditory cortex, and Wernicke's area. Remember, I said Broca's area is in the front part of the brain here. Wernicke's area is pretty much in the back. We have the prefrontal cortex, the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and here are the motor cortexes, the motor centers right under here, if you can see that. In the back part of the temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's area. This is the region of the brain that contains all of our motor neurons involved in how we understand the comprehension of speech. It was first found in 1874 by neurologist Carl Wernicke. Right? This area is located in the posterior or back third portion of the upper temporal convolution of the left hemisphere of the brain. That's a lot of words that basically says it's right here. Right? The posterior back portion of the third, you break this in thirds, 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, right? The upper third of the temporal convolution. This is a convolution, right? The gyri, the little folds in there, that's convolution of the temporal or the side part of the brain. It's also known as the motor speech area. They're the motor cortex, which is right here, sensory motor cortex, and this area here. They all come together and is utilized in speech production. How we produce speech. It's located in the inferior frontal gyrus. This is your frontal gyrus right here. This little area that I'm tracing out, frontal gyrus. Posterior is here, inferior is here. So as we look at the temporal lobe, we see the posterior frontal gyrus and the inferior gyrus, frontal gyrus, and this is where Wernicke's area is located. All right, the back part, the posterior part. So it regulates breathing patterns while we speak. Vocalization is required for normal speech, is found in this area. It coordinates activities of the muscles of respiration. This is also connected to this area here, the pons, which is right here. Um, So it coordinates the activities of the muscles of respiration, the pharynx, as well as those muscles of the cheeks, the lips, the nose, and the tongue. And if a person has damage to Broca's area, right, which we're talking about, um, sounds can be made, but words cannot be formed. Okay, so Wernicke's area, which I want to talk about over here, is located here, and this deals a lot more, as opposed to Broca's area, with understanding words. So if there is a damage to Wernicke's area as opposed to Broca's area, we won't be able to recognize things. For example, if we take a look at this word that says temporal lobe, we'll see this and we won't be able to understand that this word is temporal or this word is lobe. Concerning Broca's area, we'll be able to pronounce temporal lobe. We'll be able to see this, but we will not understand what this means. We will not be able to understand these words. We will not be able to understand these words. Okay. So let me just review this because from what I'm picking up, there may be some um, issues with explanations. So let me review this all over again, real quick. Broca's area up here is the motor speech area. This controls all the speech. It's near the motor cortex, which is right here, right in this area here. This produces our speech. It allows us to move. Or, like I said earlier, the motor cortex, which deals with any type of muscle movement, our mouth, tongues, cheeks, and all that stuff, is here. In Broca's area, we produce speech. Wernicke's area is in the back part of the temporal lobe over here, right? In Wernicke's area, we see it's in the upper third temporal convolution, which is right here. It's in the left hemisphere of the brain, and this deals with how we understand speech. So this is our understanding centers. This is our production center. And it is all connected to the temporal lobe. It is connected to the motor cortex. It is connected also to the frontal cortex of our brain. That clears things up a lot. Broca's area, Wernicke's area, two very important areas of the brain. Okay, so here is basically what the whole brain looks like if we were to cut it in half and take a look at it on the inside. We pretty much touched on the outside of the brain. Now we want to go to the inside. I mentioned a word earlier. I said limbic system. Limbic system, I said, was the seat of all of our emotions and feelings. And I said, if you cut the brain in half, this is called the sagittal section. As we cut the brain in half, we see over here where I'm tracing right now, this is your limbic system. You can see all kinds of very complex structures within here. And they all have, all kinds of names that we will take a look at in a few moments. We take a look at the center area. I want to go inside and go outside. We see this area covered right here, right? This large area is called the corpus callosum, or the corpus, the body, colossum, the large body. That's what, okay? Underneath the corpus callosum, right, we see here in this little area that I'm tracing something called the septum. Underneath the septum, we see this little area here that looks like a nut, peanut, walnut, almond, whatever you want to call it. Um, this is this area here where the almond shaped thing is. This is called the basal ganglia. And then you have the fornix right behind it. You have the area here in this pink. This is called the thalamus. Look about that. And this area right over here, whoops, sorry, right over here underneath it is called the hypothalamus. Here. And then you have the area right below the hypothalamus right here, which is called the hippocampus. This deals with the uh, thoughts, memories, long-term memory. Then we have the amygdala right underneath here. And then you have a couple glands that we have talked about, the pituitary gland. And we have the hypothalamus. This deals with some sleep-wake cycles and all that. And then as you can see right below that, we have a little thing here called the, excuse me, medulla oblongata, which is right here. And then we have this area of the medulla, which is called the tree of life. That has a very fancy name to it, which we'll hear. And then we have the different structures of the brain, and this is the spinal cord. Okay. So that's the interior part of the brain. So let's take a look again before we move on to the outside or the cerebral cortex. And this is basically your cerebral cortex, everything that I explained earlier. Um, we see the frontal field for the eyes, the motor cortex areas here. We see the parietal lobe, lobe, the visual association cortex where we see things. We see the auditory cortex here, Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere. We see Broca's area here in the middle section of the brain, right behind the prefrontal frontal cortex, right here, Broca's area, right? We got the prefrontal cortex here, the frontal cortex here. We have the entire brain structure, okay? Frontal, we have the motor, parietal, the visual, we have the temporal. All right. So let's review again sulcus. Sulcus are the deep grooves. We can see these little cuts in the brain here. Those are called sulcus. They separate the gyri, which are these folds over here. All of these are the convolutions of the brain. They are named after Luigi Rolando. This is called the central sulcus of Rolando, which is right here. And this is the part that I said if you take this and you take a knife and you cut this all the way down this way here, it splits the brain right in half. Right? This is your major central sulcus or the sulcus of Rolando. So the Rolandic fissure is part of the brain that extends from the cerebral longitudinal fissure, which is up here in this area, longitudinal, long ways, right? Up to the near the lateral sulcus of Sylvius, or the Sylvian fissure. Sylvian fissure is right over here. This is the Sylvian fissure. Okay, you don't have to memorize these. I just want to give you an idea of what you're looking at, the complexity of the brain. So this is, of course, a diagram of the brain, and we can see here in the picture, the central sulcus of Rolando is right here in white. As you can see, yes, it cuts the brain right in half. It's the center part of the brain. And we have here the motor center right here, and we have here the sensory motor center. So it takes the motor center and the sensory motor center and splits that right in half. That's your Rolando sulcus. Okay? The parietal lobe is here in blue. The red part over here, the pinkish red part over here is your frontal prefrontal cortex. You can see the yellow area here is your parietal lobe, Broca's area, Wernicke's area over here. We have the occipital lobe over here, right? Frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, right? Okay. So we take a look at this internal brain, and I want to start up top here. If we take a look at this structure right here that I'm tracing, this is your skull. This is your head, your skin, right? Several layers. And I also want to call your attention to this little area right here. We have the brain, we have the skull, but there's an area right along here, as you can see. This area is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. It is called the meninges. This is the meninges. What the job of the meninges is to do is protect the brain from any type of concussive issues. So when you smack yourself in the head like this, your brain isn't hitting the skull. It's being cushioned by this loquacious area called the meninges. Because if the meninges wasn't there, and we see this, in the traumatic brain injuries, people where they've really had their head hit, and unfortunately it squishes the meninges, and then parts of the brain do indeed uh, are infiltrated by the skull, and that causes some type of brain damage. But for the most part, minor head injuries, hits in the head like this, um, are protected by the meninges. See here the spinal cord. See here right above the spinal cord, the medulla oblongata. This is the cerebellum of the brain, right? Cerebral, cerebellum, and cortex. This is the cortex of the brain. This is the cerebellum. This here area is the midbrain. It's called the midbrain. Not very large. Okay. And we have above the midbrain, right in this area here. This is called the diencephalon. Okay. And the pons right here. And of course, we have the different parts of the brain. Frontal cortex. Here's your corpus callosum right here, the internal part of the brain. Here's your parietal lobe right in this area, the strip of your motor cortex, your sensory motor cortex. The lobe back here. Okay. And this is just an interior version of it, or what it looks like. Again, a sagittal section of the brain. Okay. Okay. This is just another section of the brain, which I'm not going to get into. When I was in college, I had to pick out the points. This was a test question. So it just came with a bunch of lines, and we had to pick out exactly what it was. And I found this, and this is basically what we are looking at here in the brain. Okay. So this is the diagram of the brain, and this is a real brain cut in half. And these are the different parts of the brain. In each one of these areas of the brain, the interconnection is remarkable. You can't just sit there and say the frontal lobe of the brain is your executive functioning, because the executive functioning, in order to have an executive functioning, you have to have all the rest of the parts of the brain connected in order to make that decision. So what am I seeing? As I'm seeing this, is it a part of space in this area? And if it's a part of space, what I'm seeing is where in space and time it's located. And if I touch it, what does it feel like? And if I can see it and I know where it is in space and I can touch it in space, what am I going to call that? Right? What am I going to call that? And now, is it exactly what that is? Is a table, regardless of what it looks like? So, what's the difference between a tray and a table? Nothing except the name. They both do the same thing. They both hold something on top of it. They both can hold the dinner plate. Where do I make that decision? From here, from the executive functioning. So how do I say a table is a table? Well, I can pronounce the word table in this area called Broca's area, right over here. So I'm saying the word table. But now how do I recognize it? Because I see a table and I know what the word table means. That's here in Wernicke's area. So I can therefore say, oh, that must be what I see and recognize as a table. It is a table that holds food, and that table is basically a tray table. It is a tray table because I can see it in space and I can fold it, and my hands are folding it. How do I know that my hands are folding it? Because I can see it, I sense it in this part of the room. It is right here in front of me. And how do I know it's in front of me? Because I can see it. So you see how all of these areas of the brain are connected? This area of the brain down here, the pons, medulla, the medulla, the pons, all of this area, deals with vital body functions that we'll see in a moment. Heart rate, respiration, pulse, breathing, all of that. This area here, the hypothalamus, has a little area in it called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That area deals with our sleep-wake cycles, which is different altogether. All right. So now we take the brain and we turn it underneath, and we start to see things there. So as we look at the brain here, we're taking this part here. We take a look at that brain, and we see uh, areas of the brain called this is the brainstem. Area is called the brainstem. Starting from the bottom, we have the spinal cord. These are the nerves of the spinal cord here, right? And we see, if we take the brainstem and we open it up, it's called the pyramid. It looks like a pyramid. Small on the bottom, big on top. It's an inverted pyramid right here, right? So we have these nerves. You don't have to understand they're called hypoglossal, but they are called hypoglossal nerves on the side of the brain. They extend outside of the spinal cord in and of itself. We have different types of nerves. The whole eye area of the spinal cord are your nerve centers. It's called your central nervous system. which consists of the spinal cord, which leads, of course, into the brain. So together, the brain and the spinal cord is called the central nervous system. We have here the accessory nerves, and then we have the vagus nerve. Very important nerve because the vagus nerve deals with the vagal system. Vagal system controls heart rate. We have the glossopharyngeal nerve. This nerve deals with our pharynx, our voice box, and things of that nature. Vestibular cochlear nerve. This deals with our hearing, all right, deep within, all right. The cochlear implants that we hear about, the cochleus, which is in our uh, inner ear near the eardrum. That's the nerve that controls it. The facial nerve comes out of this area. The facial nerve is all of our nerves within our face. Slice this nerve, and we start seeing distortions on the face. And then we have the Epstein nerve, which deals with abduction and conduction of things. And then we have here the pons. The pons area here deals with vital body functions, heart rate, respiration, pulse, right? And then from that, we have the trigeminal nerve and the trochlear nerve. Again, these two nerves deal with different areas of um, feeling, speech production, things of that nature. And as we go up, we have this area called the thalamus. Thalamic area is right below the brain. It's a very small area here. And within the hypothalamus, as I said, we have these little bodies which deal with our sleep-wake cycle. Suprachiasmatic nucleus is located within the hypothalamic region. This gives us the ability to wake up and to go to sleep. As we go above the hypothalamic region and we see these nerves wrapped around it, these nerves here are called optic nerves. Now, these nerves are wrapped around this area here because the wrappage, if we were to trace this back, goes to the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe has these two nerves, these optic nerves, which come out. Now, the interesting thing about the optic nerves, as they go from the back part of the brain to the front, they crisscross, right? Just like the nerves from the spinal column. They come out and they go to, I'm sorry, these do not crisscross. The nerves from the spinal column crisscross. These nerves and the optic nerve go right to the eyes, left side, right side, the appropriate way that they're supposed to go. Apologies for that. But as the nerves come from the spinal cord into the base of the brain, into this area here, right, the thalamic area, they do crisscross. So nerves to the right side go to the left side of the brain. Nerves from the left side go to the right side of the brain. So if there's damage, let's say we have a cerebral vascular accident, a stroke, and we see somebody cannot move their left arm, it's because there's some damage to the right side of the brain. If we see the person can't move their right arm, it's because there's some type of neurological damage to the left side of the brain. And this deals with everything. So if we see a drooping in the right side of the mouth, chances are there's neurological damage to the nerves from the spinal cord to the right side of the brain. If we see the right side of the mouth with damage, left side nerves, right? However, when we're taking a look at optic nerves, the optic nerves go straight out to where they need to. So as you're looking at it this way, this looks like your right side, even though if you cross your hands this way, it's the right side. This goes to your right eyeball, left eyeball. All right. So this is the basic structure of the brainstem and what that looks like there. Okay. So the oculomotor nerve. All right, remember I said this is the two nerves that go to your eyeballs here, left and right. There's also a nerve that allows you to blink. This is your ocular motor nerve here, and that's basically what that does. I don't want to get into the rest of these because this gets into a lot of complex stuff, which you don't really need to know. All right, all right. The pons. We have the pons over here in the back part of the brain. We have the cerebellum way in the back, and from the cerebellum we have the pons. And it deals with pulse, respiration, heart rate, breathing, medulla, and we have what we call the reticular formation. So all of this deals with an area of, from here, we have the major neurons, because this, don't forget, leads to the spinal cord. let's take a look at neurons. This is a very long video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop it here, have you digest that, and then we're going to come back to this in another video, and we're going to take a look at the neurons.